According to the Russian imperial census of 1897, less than half of the empire's citizens spoke Russian as their native language. Over 11% of the entire population, or almost 14 million people, were Muslim, and most of them spoke one of the Turkic languages. This was because in the second half of the 19th century, Russia annexed, seized, and conquered enormously large territories in Central Asia. To increase awareness of the growing empire and introduce its newly acquired peoples of non-Slavic descent, collectively called Inorodцы, different Russian societies, particularly the Society of Friends of Natural History, Anthropology, and Ethnography, which I'll call OLIAE, organized large-scale exhibitions. For instance, the first ethnographic exhibition of 1867 displayed 1,200 different artifacts and objects, including musical instruments, 600 photos, 450 outfits, and almost 300 mannequins dressed in traditional costume, representing over 40 different ethnicities living in Russia. The organizers' aim was to demonstrate the diversity and grandeur of Russia and show the empire's ability to manage and control the great variety of lands and peoples. This exhibition, as well as other ethnographic exhibitions, also underlined Russia's new imperial ideology by using the visual arts to construct a cultural hierarchy of peoples living in the imperial borderlands. When the Music-Ethnography Committee, or MEC, a branch of OLIAE, was founded, musicians from Russia's largest metropoles also contributed to the creation of this multi-ethnic image, or rather soundscape, of the empire. Many composers arranged folk songs collected from peoples living all over Russia. These arrangements, mostly for piano and voice, were performed at so-called ethnographic concerts, which took place in Moscow between 1893 and 1911. These concerts reflected Russia's urgent efforts to establish its national identity as a unified multi-ethnic state. Despite all the variety of peoples presented in the ethnographic concerts, only the arrangements of 4 Turkic-speaking Asians were published by the MEC in 1913 in a large volume of over 130 folk song arrangements, 6 Bashkir tunes, 4 Tatar songs, 4 Taranchi songs, and 1 Teptar song. Among these Asians, only the Taranchis were people living in Central Asia. Even though some Central Asians, such as Sarts, outnumbered the Taranchi and became subject of the empire a few decades earlier, the Taranchis were more present in the MEC's publication and received truly special treatment. This, I believe, is due to the fact that the Taranchis lived on the lands bordering modern China, and some Russian officials contemplated expanding the empire further to the territory they called Eastern Turkestan, now called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. In this talk, I'll focus on the representation of Taranchi, or modern Uyghur people, in late 19th century Russian literature and ethnographic concerts, and explore 3 questions. Why were Russian composers interested in these small ethnic groups while other more prominent Inorodцы remained overlooked? What kind of image did Russian ethnographers and musicians present to the Russian public to convince it that Taranchis were people worthy of imperial attention? How did Russia's political relations with China shape the final image of Taranchis presented in the 1913 publication of the MEC? To answer these questions, let me provide you with some political, historical, and cultural context surrounding Russian-Taranchi relations. The Taranchis who lived in Kulja or Ili, within the larger land called Eastern Turkestan, were people closely related to Russia's Turkestani subjects. In the mid-19th century, after joining a mass revolt against their Manchu Chinese oppressors, the Taranchis, along with Dungans or Hui, gained independence and established 3 states. The Taranchi state in the Ili or Kulja region, the state of Yetishehar in Kashgaria, bordering Tibet in the south, and the union of Dungan cities in Urumqi and Manas in the east. Russian officials, concerned that the Muslim insurgents would seek British military support and incite uprising in Russian Turkestan, decided to eliminate the Taranchi Sultanate in Ili region and occupied it in 1871. After a 10-year presence bending to Chinese diplomatic pressure, the Russians withdrew from Kulja and signed the Treaty of St. Petersburg, which let the people choose to either stay in the region or cross the border to live in Russian Turkestan. Frightened by the recent mass extermination of people in Yetishar, Kulja's Muslims, about 70,000 people, rushed to embrace Russian citizenship and united with their relatives living on the Russian side. The inclusion of Taranchi music in the MEC concerts thus offered an opportunity to introduce Russians to the newly acquired Asians, whose destiny had recently fallen into the hands of the Russian Empire. A few other factors contributed to the Russian interest in the Taranchis. One of them is the popularity of the Asianist and Aryanist movements, which proclaimed Russia's historic and cultural affiliation with the East. The proponents of these movements believed that the most ancient Aryan branches were represented by the Scythian tribes who inhabited Central Asia. In their own version of Aryanism, Russian intellectuals envisioned the Scythians as being closely related to the Asian Slavs and used this link to assert both Russia's Aryan essence and, by extension, and somewhat paradoxically, its Asianness and Europeanness at the same time. When in the mid-1870s, Russian explorers and military officials published reports and articles that the sedentary people of eastern Turkestan were of Aryan origin, these theories added a new political twist to the Taranchi question. Some Russian intellectuals went as far as analyzing physical traits of the Taranchis to ensure their Aryan origin. Dr. Vladimir Paisel, for instance, analyzed data from more than 300 Taranchis and suggested that these people living in eastern Turkestan could have been, and I quote, the forefathers of Slavs and Teutons, end quote. Paisel believed that, besides physical traits, Taranchis proved their Aryan origin through other similarities they shared with Aryan culture, such as civil order, they called it гражданственность, agricultural developments, and craftsmanship. Such statements would have encouraged Russian readers to believe that the new imperial conquest would simply connect Russian ancestral lands with those of their Aryan brothers. Besides Aryanism, Russian writers paid particular attention to the Taranchis' pre-Muslim religious practices and the unusual tolerance towards Christians. Many suggested that the acceptance of other religions could have been the result of the Taranchis' Nestorian Christian and Buddhist past. Overall, these 19th century Russian writings gave their readers the impression that the Taranchis were subjects worthy of imperial attention. On the eve of Russia's concession of Kulja to China, some Russian officials who served in the region raised the question whether it was right to transfer the land of Taranchis to Chinese authorities, knowing that their people would face harsh consequences for participating in a rebellion. However, these voices were not heard at the highest echelons of Russia's political elite. 9 million rubles in silver, paid in the 1880s by the Qing Empire as an indemnity, helped the Russian governing elite to forget about its ambition to control this region and leave behind all ties forged during their 10-year presence in Kulja. It is striking that the destiny of Taranchi people not only touched Russians who worked in eastern Turkestan, but also inspired musicians who lived as far away as European Russia. One composer, Reinhold Glier, attempted to represent Taranchi's history to the wider Russian public in a thoughtful way. However, because of the complex political situation on the Russian-Chinese border, he was unable to tell an accurate story. The song Nosgum, arranged by Glier for the 10th ethnographic concert, went through serious alterations and modified its political message. The story of Nosgum dates back to the 1820s rebellion in Kashgar against the Qing Empire. When the leader of the rebellion, Jahangir Khoja, was captured, all the male rebels were killed, and the women were given as wives to the Jungar and Kalmyk people, who were nomadic military allies of the Qing army. A woman named Nazgum managed to escape from her masters twice, but when she was captured a third time, she was publicly decapitated. Nazgum was believed to have written several songs that had been transmitted orally and transcribed at the end of the 19th century. For any Taranchi or Uyghur, the name Nazgum and her songs conveyed and still convey a symbolic meaning of freedom, resistance against oppressors, and love for the motherland. Significantly, all Nazgum songs were translated and published by the Russian official and Orientologist Nikolai Pantusov, who served in Russian Turkestan for more than 3 decades. Reinhold Glier, who carefully read Pantusov's article about Nazgum, planned to accurately transmit her story. As you can see in the left side of this slide, the composer copied information on the origin of the songs verbatim from Pantusov's article. However, the most important passage that explains the circumstances of the song's creation, that it was composed during the war between Jahangir Hoja and the Chinese troops, is crossed out and altered with another phrase stating that the song was composed, quote, during the internal strife, end quote. This text modification fundamentally changes the meaning and political connotation of the song. It no longer represents the struggle between two peoples who were and remain linguistically, religiously, and culturally distinct from each other, but simply mentions an internal conflict in a homogeneous land outside Russia. Besides the complete change of the song's historical and political meaning, its very name was modified. As you can see in the right part of the slide, in the 1913 publication, the song appeared under the title Gosgum instead of Nozgum, and the name, when it occurs in the text, is not even capitalized. The alteration of just one letter seems at first insignificant and even accidental. However, in the context of Russia's Chinese political relations, it's more likely that all of these changes help to obscure the song's political implications in order to prevent any possible misunderstanding that could have had a negative impact on Russia's diplomatic relations with its eastern neighbor. Satisfied with a handsome amount of money, Russian officials were no longer interested in political affairs outside of the empire's southeastern borders. The growing anti-Western and unsurprisingly anti-Russian sentiments in China at the turn of the century and Russia's infamous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 significantly weakened Russia's control over the Far East and resulted in the empire's more measured diplomatic conduct in Asia. At the beginning of the 1910s, Russian officials signed a number of custom contracts and border agreements that clarified territorial demarcations between Russia and China in Inner Manchuria. Obviously, it was not the right moment to demonstrate any support for ethnic minorities in eastern Turkestan. Thus, the change in the political situation significantly transformed Glier's original message. Despite the confusion created in both the text and context of the song, the piano arrangement of Nazgum makes a definitive statement that Russians and Taranchis are culturally similar. It must be stressed that not only Glier's arrangement of Nazgum, but all the Taranchi songs performed and published by the MEC suggested such a conclusion. Glier injected the Taranchi songs with certain musical elements associated with Russianness. In the accompaniment of his arrangement of Nazgum, for instance, he introduced harmonies with the D natural in F minor that color the song with the Dorian mode, which is not implied in the original melody. In the second half of the 19th century, the Dorian mode was at first associated with purely Russian sound, but was then gradually introduced into music representing Russia's inarodsi, such as Georgians, Tatars, and Bashkirs. At the turn of the century, the Dorian mode seemed to signify the authentic sound of peoples embraced by Russia in its soundscape. out of 4 arrangements of Taranchi songs published by the MEC are colored with the Dorian harmony, despite the fact that the Dorian mode is not at all prevalent in Taranchi folk music. For Glier, the use of the Dorian likely performed 2 functions. On the one hand, it suggested the authenticity of the original tunes, and on the other, it implied similarity between Russian and Asian music, an idea that was particularly popular among the followers of the Asianism and Aryanism. Besides interest in Dorian mode, the arrangement of another Taranchi song, Guby Tvoi Sakhar, reveals Glier's inclination to avoid the leading note in a dominant harmony. As Marina Frolova-Walker observed, many Russian composers, including Balakirev and Tchaikovsky, often eliminated dominant function in minor mode songs since they believed that the presence of a leading note in a dominant harmony was a sign of corruption coming from Western or Eastern musical traditions. Glier, in his arrangement of Guby Tvoi, also carefully avoided the leading note, which resulted in the absence of major dominant chords at cadences. Thus, Glier's arrangements of Taranchi songs do not suggest any couleur locale that would point out their specifically Central Asian origin. Instead, he introduced into Taranchi music some elements associated with Russianness, and by doing this, reduced both cultural and musical distance between Russia and its other. However, the composer's initial plan to present the Taranchi as people living in a complex geopolitical situation failed. Because of political and economic concerns, the story of Nazgûm was completely recontextualized and detached from its historical, political, and traditional meaning. Despite being absorbed into the empire, the minority voices of the Taranchis remained unheard, and in the context of Russian-Chinese friendly relations stood no real chance of being heard. This had lasting implications. Then, as it remains today, the destiny of the Taranchi or Uyghur minorities and their economic and cultural development lay in the hands of world's major powers. In the face of cultural and physical genocide of Uyghurs in the concentration camps of China, forceful sterilization of women from the age of 19 to 59, organ harvesting from young people, Uyghur children sent to orphanages and prison-like schools, and many other atrocities. If no action is taken today, tomorrow the voices of the Taranchis or Uyghurs might be extinguished forever. Thank you.